Hello, my name is Crystal Petry, and you are watching another episode of the Crystal Petry Podcast, Season 4. What happens when you're running a business, leading teams, and building a career, all while fighting for your life? Today's guest has faced not one, not two, but three cancer diagnoses, including stage 4 triple positive breast cancer, and transformed her experience into a mission that helps leaders navigate life, changing diagnosis without losing themselves, their purpose, or their business. Welcome to the podcast, Deb.
Oh my gosh, Crystal, I am so honored to be here. You have such a fabulous podcast, and it truly is my honor to be here.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, Miss Deb, tell us, where in the world are you?
So I am just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. It's a little cool here today. It's kind of amazing, but yeah, down here in Georgia.
Good. The Peach State, as they call it. The
It
Peach
is.
State.
And I probably shouldn't say I'm not a big fan of peaches.
I'm not either, but it'll be our secret.
Shh.
It'll be our secret. I'm not a fan either. Okay, so let's get into this podcast. So we're going to take a hard pivot here, Deb.
Mm-hmm.
In 2015, doctors told you that you had stage 4 triple positive breast cancer. What was the very first thought that went through your mind, and how did that moment change the trajectory of your life?
Well, the first thought was something that we can't say on your very professional podcast.
Okay.
But then, and initially I was diagnosed with stage 0, which was, hey, we're just going to watch this. Let's not worry about it. And then it was the old comment. But I really did think I don't have time for this. I'm sorry, I'm busy. What the heck?
Right. So from stage 0 to stage 4, how long in between was that? 1 month, 1 year?
So initially it was stage 0, and then 2 months or so later they said stage 3, and then several months after that we did another test and decided at that point it was stage 4. So altogether it was about a 5-month process to go from the initial, hey, you've got a bad mammogram, to danger.
Right. So you made the conscious decision to not become the cancer girl. Now, I've never had cancer, thank God, but I feel like I would have that same thought. Like, I don't want to be defined as the girl with cancer. I want to be defined by other things that I've done and accomplished in life. But what does that phrase mean to you, and why was it so important to protect your identity beyond your diagnosis?
Well, it really was a matter of, I am so much more than that.
Right.
It is just part of me. Now, I do have to admit, I have had AI generate an image of me as cancer girl, right? But yeah, that's just a very small portion of who I am and who I will always be going forward.
I love that. And I agree. I agree with that. Okay, so you have this, what I would consider a horrific, scary diagnosis, but you chose to keep working. Most people that I have known that have battled cancer, they put work to the back, or they quit so they can focus on recovery and healing. But you chose to focus on recovery, healing, and work.
Well, big part of that was, I was very fortunate. I did not have to work. My husband, he has since retired, but he was the breadwinner. That was, where our insurance was. And so it really was a choice whether I wanted to continue leading my company or not. And I decided I needed something to think about aside from, oh my gosh, I've got this diagnosis.
Right.
So, and I love my clients, I love what I do. And I thought, I mean, originally the thought had been, hey, this was just going to take several months, and turned out to not be that. But yeah, I wanted to keep working the entire time. Were there times I couldn't? Sure. But for the most part, it really was, I need something to focus my brain on.
Okay. What do most people misunderstand or not even know when it comes to having a diagnosis
Mhm.
such as yours, but continuing to work or lead in an industry?
Mhm. Well, I think one of the things that anybody thinks about, and I thought about this when I was diagnosed also, was you're going to die, right? Cancer is going to kill you. Because most of the time when we think of that, we think of people who passed away. Now, I mean, statistically, cancer actually kills very few people. A lot of people have very minor diagnosis, all sorts of things. But we do think, oh my gosh, we're going to die.
Mhm.
And and then our next thought is, oh, we're going to get really sick. We're going to lose our hair. We're not going to be able to function. We've all heard the term chemo brain,
Mhm.
and it is very real. I mean, those nasty, icky chemicals really do change some things in your brain. But I think we all think this is really something that is going to cause a major upheaval in our lives.
Did it cause a major upheaval in your life?
Oh yeah. you know,
Mm.
and and I actually, I'm special. We know that,
Yes,
right?
I do
And
know
and
this.
so I unfortunately had lots of challenges. I developed a catastrophic complication from my very first treatment that almost took my life. I developed septic shock. And that about 75% of the time is fatal. And but it was one of those things where it was just really strange. And along the way, I kept having more things that the doctors had never seen. I think I'm in lots of medical journals now and all sorts of things. But, I try to not tell people a lot about, because I don't want to scare them, right? What happened to me happens less than 1% of the time. And, most of the time people are able to get through it. I did have to be Miss Special Girl.
As Miss Special Girl, Deb, were there moments during that process, especially when you went into septic shock, the chemotherapy, the losing of your hair, that you thought, I probably shouldn't be working, like I should quit?
Mhm.
Did you have that thought, and what made you keep
Mhm.
working?
Well, like I said, I love my clients and I love what I do, but there were times where it was more just maybe an hourly thing or a day thing, right?
Mhm.
Where I was exhausted. My brain didn't work. I mean, I did lose a pretty good chunk of time. And and there were times where I would think maybe I really should just throw it all in and not be doing this. But I'd get over that, and and I know, you mentioned it at the start, everybody's different. I mean, for some people, they really want to focus on healing, and that's fabulous. But yeah, I kept thinking, well, I got to keep going. I need to keep going.
Mhm. Our next My next set of questions, Deb, we're going to talk about executives and how they live and function with a diagnosis. But before I get to that, did you tell your clients that you were going through cancer treatment and chemo, or did you just continue on as normal?
I told them, and that is an entirely personal decision for anybody who's going through this, and I know we're going to discuss this further, but I am a sole proprietor. And so if I wasn't doing the work wasn't going to get done. And so
Mm.
I really did feel that my clients deserved to know what was going on, that, there would be periods of time I would totally drop off the face of the earth. And I was very fortunate that they said, what can we do to help?
Wow.
That's part of why I continued working, is they were so good about it. They could have easily said, you can't do the work, so we're going to fire you. Right. I mean, that would have been understandable. They might have said, well, you need to go focus on healing, so we're going to hire somebody else. That would have been understandable too. But like I said, mine said, what can we do to help? And, I was very fortunate in that.
The executives that are listening to you right now, Deb, that are watching you right now, business owners such as yourself, sole proprietors such as yourself, who receive life-changing news, life-changing diagnosis, what would you say is the biggest mistake they make in the first few weeks of receiving that news, that diagnosis?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a mistake, but I would say, it's one of those things where, like I said, we think, well, we don't have time for this. And so we just keep going. But we also definitely think, well, and I did go through this, but initially, but we think, well, we can't tell anybody because they're going to think we can't do our job. And so we try and deal with this on our own. And, the nice thing is with many diagnoses, people never know, right? Because it is something where there's really no outward appearance. You're able to take care of it. But, if you're in chemo, if you had surgery, you're going to start giving visible signs that, that you're going through something. But yeah, we do think, well, I can't tell anyone because they are going to think I can't do my job or I can't run my company.
So do you think that the executives, the directors, the leaders, should they tell their clients? Should they tell the people that work for them? How do they decide who needs to know and who doesn't?
That's a really hard decision, and part of it is, what do they do? Like I mentioned, I was the only person providing the service. So I felt that I needed to tell people, if you have a great support system that is providing the service or the product, whatever it is, then you might not need to tell your clients. Other people can pick up the slack. You might not need to tell, the people you work with. Again, it's entirely a personal decision. I do think you need to tell some people at least a little bit as to what's going on. But, it is something that you want to control that narrative. You don't want that narrative controlling you. You don't want people saying, wow, boy, she really looks rough. She must be drinking on the weekends, or, all those various things. You want to be able to be in charge of that narrative.
Have you had any experience with people treating you different once they found out about your diagnosis, and how did you handle that? But before you answer that, Deb, I just want to add to what you were saying. I think that a lot of executives, directors, and leaders probably don't tell because of the question I just asked, how people will treat you
right
once they find out.
It was very interesting, and it still is, 10 and almost 11 years into this process. Some of them won't talk about it at all. They just, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to know. Sometimes they don't want to talk about it because they don't want us to feel bad. They, they don't want to keep bringing it up. And there were people who totally ghosted me. Just absolutely would not. Was
this friends, family?
Friends that I'd had for 40 some years. Wow. And they still won't talk about it. And I mean, clearly that friendship had kind of run its course. But and I think it is more people just don't know what to say. And so they don't bring it up. They don't want us to feel bad. And then there are those who kind of say some inappropriate things. And they don't mean it that way, so, I had one person several years into this journey say, so are you still doing that cancer thing?
Wow. Okay.
And I said, well, yes, but, I also knew that he didn't mean it kind of the way it came out. Right. And so, I just, well, yes, and I've also found that a lot of times people will just kind of refer to it and leave it up to me as to what I'm going to respond. So, in many cases, I just say, the biggest question that you get now is, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How are you doing? And I tell people I'm doing good. I don't use the word fine. To me,
Mhm.
that's a four-letter word that starts with F. But I will tell people I'm doing good. Even if I'm having a bad day, I'm still going to tell them I'm doing good.
Okay. What is the best response for you? Which
Mhm.
one did you appreciate the
Mhm.
most? I'm sure the friends
Mhm.
that ghosted you,
Mhm.
you did not appreciate
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
But maybe the friend that was
Mhm.
very direct and
Mhm.
abrasive
Mhm.
about it.
Mhm.
Maybe the friends that beat around the bush about
Mhm.
it. Or maybe the friends
Mhm.
that didn't bring it up.
Mhm.
Which one did you prefer?
I actually like the ones that just out and out asked.
Mm,
Right? And because then I could kind of deal with it. Do I get into a lot of detail? No. They don't want the detail.
mm,
They just, they want to know a little bit. It's and those that ignore it, unless there was something directly that I needed to deal with. So to say, okay, hey, I've got treatment tomorrow, so I'm not going to be able to attend a meeting. I usually don't mention it at all. They know what's going on, and I figure if they don't really want to know, then I'm not going to bring it up either. But yeah, I like the people who ask. And a lot of times what I have found is, first of all, they care, right? They're asking because they care. Unfortunately, sometimes they're asking because they know of somebody else who's going through it.
mm.
And or maybe themselves, and so they need a little bit of support that way. But I always, even the people who said terribly inappropriate things, I knew that they meant that they cared. I mean, they just didn't quite know how to verbalize it the right way.
How did you tell? And I'm
Mhm.
asking to give the
Mhm.
executives
Mhm.
and the
Mhm.
leadership who are listening
Mhm.
a way to
Mhm.
communicate
Mhm.
this, because it's one thing to I have to tell
Mhm.
someone, as you
Mhm.
stated.
Right.
How do you
Mhm.
tell them?
Mhm.
Do you send an
Mhm.
email? Do you a
Mhm.
phone call, virtual, face to
Right.
face?
Right. A lot of that again depends on the business. My clients happen to be here in Atlanta, but I still just told them in an email. Because we didn't have face-to-face meetings. But it really was, I think it was just part of another email, kind of an oh by the way. you
Mm,
know. And so it wasn't a separate thing that they were going to, get all panicky over. I just said, just wanted you to know I was recently diagnosed. I will keep you posted, and I will do the best I can to continue my job as I've been doing it.
okay. How do you, or what advice do you give leaders who are scared that
Mhm.
if I tell people, even one person, about
Mhm.
my
Mhm.
diagnosis, that it might damage
Mhm.
confidence in me as a leader and me being able to help
Mhm.
my clients
Mhm.
and run my business? What advice do
Mhm.
you give that person?
It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be human, right? And I think what the people who, either your clients or the people who work with you and for you, they just want to know everything's going to be okay. So, if you tell them, hey, I'm going through this, I'll keep you posted as best I can. But then what they really like is when you say, I might need your help,
Mm,
because you have great people who work for you. You hired smart people. You didn't hire them because they couldn't do the job. You hired them because they're smart, knowledgeable people. And so when you say, I'm going to need your help, if they don't step up, there's a different problem. But if they say, what can we do? Even if it's, hey, I'll take over this meeting, or, whatever it is, you want to give them that opportunity to shine and really show that you have faith in them.
Aren't people scared to do that?
Mhm.
Scared to step back and let
Mhm.
someone else run the meeting?
Oh, yeah.
Scared to step back
Mhm.
and let someone else
Mhm.
handle this
Mhm.
client for fear
Mhm.
that maybe I'll get fired, maybe they'll do it
Right.
better than me?
Mhm. Mhm. That definitely exists. The what if they figure out they don't need me? Well, they might. I mean, and but those are also, I think, the times where, we have people who they're scared to go on vacation, right? They won't
Yes.
take any time off because what if somebody figures out they don't need them? Well, okay, maybe I, figured out that Bob does a better job at running that meeting than I did. That's okay. Again, I hired Bob because Bob's a really good employee, and but then that's going to free me up to do something else, maybe business related or personal related. But it is something I think that people think about, is I could lose my job. There are, some federal laws and things like that apply. And I am not an attorney. And so I'm not going to get anywhere near addressing things like that because they cannot fire you for a disability. But that's as close as I'm going to go on giving advice on that. But, it is something that people worry about. They're going to say, hey, we didn't need you. Well, maybe they didn't.
Mhm. Can you give us some tangible ways that you continue to run your business while
Mhm.
dealing with this diagnosis, while treatment and healing and things like that, as far as like, how do you send the emails, return the phone calls, attend the meetings? What are some tangible ways to be able to handle all of that?
Mhm. Technology is great. I mean, hospitals and doctors' offices all now have really good Wi-Fi.
Yes.
I've been in the hospital sometimes for a week at a time and nobody knew because I was okay enough that I could keep working. And so I just sat there in my little hospital bed and worked, and nobody knew. I still go in for treatment every 21 days. And the whole time I'm there, I'm checking emails, I'm sending emails, I'm doing work. But, you also need to focus on yourself. I don't want people to be thinking, well, I have to keep working. I have to keep working. It might be that you're going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Or I can't, right? Back to that old chemo brain comment. And so be thinking about what you can reasonably do and do well, and how you can do it. But it also might mean adjusting your schedule, things like that. But none of that, we did all that during COVID, right?
Yes.
And we discovered, whoa, I can work on evenings and weekends and it's okay. Now, of course, as a business owner, a lot of times we're doing that anyway, right? Or as an executive, you're checking emails at 10 o'clock at night. So it might be that you need to kind of think about your schedule and say, mornings are not going to be good for me for a while. So I'm not going to respond to emails and schedule meetings until 10 a.m. Whatever it is, just kind of think about what's going on and be flexible with it. Give yourself that grace too. This is, you really do need to focus on your own healing. I tell people it's the airplane rule, right? You put your mask on first before you can help anybody else. And you do need to focus on your healing or your treatment is not going to go well. And so do what you need to do to make sure that you're, taking care of yourself. But yeah, I mean, there's Zoom, all these various things. Technology is definitely our friend now.
Mhm. Deb, you've mentioned this a couple times. What is chemo brain?
So you hear people talk about this, and chemo is an extremely, and I don't even know how many different actual types of chemo. When I had chemo, I had 8 different drugs. And it all depends on what you're diagnosed with, and as to what you get. But it's an incredibly potent cocktail of icky, nasty drugs. There's a reason your hair falls out. You have killed those hair follicles. There's a reason, it is very strong, and it does affect your brain chemistry, sometimes short-term, sometimes long-term. I mean, there are people who still feel fuzzy, years later and things like that, because it does go in and it does things. Now, one of the things that I always tell people is please keep your care team informed as to what you're feeling, whether it's chemo brain, whether it's nausea, all of those various things, because they might be able to adjust the dose. They might be able to make some changes. Don't just assume, oh, I'm taking chemo, therefore I will be throwing up, I will lose my hair, and I will have chemo brain. No, talk to your care team about it, because they might be able to make some changes or some suggestions. There's also things, I remember one of the things that one of my doctors told me, she said, You have got to read. And I went, read? Huh? What? And she said, I don't even care what you're reading. It can be People magazine, but keep your brain going. In the infusion room where I get my treatments, they have crossword puzzles. They have all sorts of things to kind of keep your brain active. But again, give yourself that grace to know, okay, I might just be a little sluggish for a while.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so back to technology, which you described as a great thing, and
Mhm.
I agree. What would you say is something that executives and leadership, entrepreneurs need to have? What systems, what structure do they need to have, as well as technology,
Mhm.
do you think they need to have in place before a crisis
Mhm.
occurs?
Right. That's one of the things that, especially as small business owners and solopreneurs, we don't frequently have strategies, tactics, procedures in place. It's all in our brains,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so a lot of it's called business continuity planning. So you want to have all of those things written down and where someone can find them. Whether you're a sole proprietor or you're running a major department or a major company, have the things written down. Some of them are things like what your passwords are. Now, obviously, you need to be careful who gets those.
Mm-hmm.
Contacts. If you're responsible for clients, okay, what are all the contact information for your clients? Again, all those things we keep in our brains. And a lot of it is, I know on X date of every month, I have to do this report. Okay. What happens if either A, you can't do that report on that day, or B, what happens if it doesn't get done? So again, have that written down. I tend to work on the hit by a bus theory. What happens if I get hit by a bus tomorrow? And I did kind of get hit by a bus.
Yes.
But it was things like, my computer, my entire computer is password protected. So my husband couldn't get into it to even do anything. Where's my bank? Who's my insurance people? All of those things. Just have that written down. It's just a good business practice to have taken care of all of that. And you're not, one of the things I like to tell people is you really might want to go on vacation and, not have to be bothered with people emailing you and calling you because they know, oh, on the 10th day of every month, I need to do that report. When Deb's here, she's going to do that report. But when she's on vacation, I need to do that report.
Did you learn any lessons about running a business while fighting cancer?
Mhm. Priorities. And I mentioned it is the most important thing to take care of yourself. You might love your business, you might live for your business, that might be everything, but your business may or may not survive without you. I mean, that's a different question, but you have got to remember that it is just your business. Now, I founded my company. It's my baby. I certainly want it to continue,
Mm-hmm.
but if it doesn't, the world will not end. What is more important is that I protect my health and that I get better. And I think that's one of the things, especially when we are business leaders, we get really focused on the fact that our company is the most important thing in the world. No, it's not. And that's one of the things that I have discovered with people is they reprioritize when they have faced a serious diagnosis. It's like, wow, maybe I really do need to spend more time with my kids, reading books, letting people, delegating to people and empowering them. That's okay. The company is not my be all end all.
If a business owner, and I'm sure there are plenty, are listening to you right now, Deb, and maybe maybe someone out of that group has just received a life-changing diagnosis or life-changing news, what would you say the first 2 or 3 things they need to do?
Breathe. Right?
Yes.
When you are told you've got something serious, whether it's cancer, ALS, any of the things that are, major type of diagnosis, your brain goes, ugh, That's my interpretation of your brain shorting out. And, just stop and pause. And, and I also tell people, do not turn to Dr. Google first. You might Google a couple things. I did. I mean, I used to work for the American Cancer Society, and I used to work for an oncologist. So I, know just enough to be dangerous, but they were using terms that I didn't know. So I did look them up on Google. But, if you Google, even a specific cancer diagnosis, you're going to get overwhelmed very quickly with tons of information. So don't do that. Don't turn to AI either. I love AI, but again, it's just going to pull from everything that's out there. So take the time to pause and then figure out, okay, what do I need to do? What are the first thing is, what are the questions I need to ask my care team? And those are going to be things like, what can I expect from my treatment? Am I going to have downtime? Am I going to have to take time off? All of those various things. Then figure out, who do I need to tell? Your family and friends are probably going to be top of that list. But yeah, who do I need to tell and what do I need to tell? But realize that in most cases, it's not, I have to make these decisions in a day. You have time to kind of go through this. Now, there are times where, you go in and they say, this is really serious. We're putting you in the hospital right now. And that's kind of all plans are out the door. But yeah, take the time to really think, okay, how am I going to get through this? Maybe it is just you go and you sit under a tree for a while and, and kind of pause, but don't make life-changing or business-changing decisions immediately spur of the moment. Give yourself time to digest and kind of go through things.
I know at the beginning of our conversation, Deb, one of the things that we talked about was you not becoming the cancer girl, that not becoming your identity. How did you manage to, and this is me assuming that you did, how did you manage to not become the cancer girl with that consuming who you are and becoming your identity, which I would assume during this time, and maybe even today, that's all that people are talking about. The doctors, the specialists, your husband, friends, that's all you are probably thinking about.
Sometimes you just got to change the subject. And I don't bring it up. That is kind of the thing. Now, I am much more open with what I'm going through than many people, but that is very deliberate because of what I do, right? I want people to know, hey, this is okay. But yeah, you don't have to share everything. Some people want to. I mean, that's the thing. But if you're not talking about it all of the time, other people aren't going to be talking about it all of the time either. And if somebody asks, then you have the choice. You can, give them a one sentence answer, or you can go into more detail. But yeah, you just, and you can always reframe. In part of what I have done is media training, right? That's part of my career is I have done that. And we all know, you get that question that you're like, ew. And so you answer it and then you say, but I'd really like to, I'm here to talk about X. All right. So you just redirect. And, we've all seen politicians do that. Right.
Yes.
And that really is, it's a very sound communications principle. You respond, you don't ignore that question, but you don't really need to go into a lot of detail about it. But then you can say, but, Crystal, I'm really here to talk about X.
Okay, as we get ready to wrap up, Deb, I have a couple more questions for you. If you could sit down with yourself back in 2015, I believe it was, when you received the stage 4 diagnosis, what would you tell yourself at that time? And what message would you leave with her or leave with you back in 2025?
It sounds silly, but I think I would say it'll be okay. Whatever is going to happen will happen. It'll be okay.
Yes. And my final question for you, what is your intention in this space? You have been very open, very vulnerable on my podcast. So thank you very much. But I know this has become like a life mission for you,
Mhm.
being open, being vulnerable,
Mhm.
telling people about
Mhm.
your cancer diagnosis. What is your intention with this?
Well, again, thank you so much for this opportunity. It really is a delight to talk with you. I would tell people you're in charge. Not your doctors, not your business, not the insurance company, not your family, even. I was talking to somebody and she said, I don't want to do X treatment, but my husband really, really thinks I should. Well, that's a different discussion. And she might go with what her husband says, but you're the one that's in charge. And we do tend to look at those people in those fancy white coats with the stethoscope and think they're God. No, they're
Mhm.
not. They do have more knowledge about this than we do, but they don't get to make those decisions for us.
Right, right. Deb, you have been an amazing guest. Like, I can't even describe it. Thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And to my community, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. You can get Deb's podcast along with all of my other podcasts on YouTube Podcasts as well as Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.